I'm very privileged to have with us someone who's thinking on the issues that seem to be at work here, namely that this is an individual not just disgruntled about going off to Afghanistan in the service of a country that apparently he wasn't all that wild about, but apparently animated, as so many of these attacks are, by what authoritative Islam calls Sharia. And that expert is Diana West. Diana, welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. It is great to have you with us.
Thank you, Frank. I'm delighted to be here.
You are a columnist, an author, and certainly one of the best spoken people I know on this very politically challenging subject. So tell us a little bit. I see a post on your site, dianawest.net, today, entitled Flashback Fort Hood's Major General Jeffrey Hammond and the Quran Sniper. Give us the story here.
Well, this is, we've been at this war for so long that a lot of our themes now are recurring, and a lot of our personalities are making second and third
return appearances.
Yes, I mean, which is part of our tragedy here, but we should really start to be able to, as they used to say, connect the dots. And what I was struck by was the fact that the former commander, it turns out he left in August, but the former commander of Fort Hood was someone I had first come into not contact with, but certainly into editorial contact with back last year at the time of what we know as the Quran Sniper story, which was, of course, when the soldier used a Quran for target practice.
Right.
And the government...
A non-Muslim, needless to say, soldier.
Yes, an American soldier. And
desecrating the Quran, we were told.
Yes, and we had apologies coming from the then President Bush on down to Major General Hammond, who was at the time a commander in Baghdad, who gave a profuse and abject apology and ordered one of his officers to kiss a Quran and present it in a very reverential and unctuous kind of ceremony to a bunch of Iraqi tribal elders. And I was just struck by this because here we have this abject treatment of the Quran, which I will argue is a blueprint for jihad, not in the end protecting his men against what is turning certainly to look and sound very much like an act of jihad. So again, we come back to the notion of years and years of appeasing Islam, of accommodating Sharia, of turning ourselves inside out not to offend Islam and offend Muslims, and really prostrate ourselves in the face of their own laws, which would be against shooting a Quran. It's not against the law to shoot any book in our country. I mean, you can do anything you want to a book. Right. It doesn't matter. But this was called a criminal act by our military, which, if you look at that, you say, well, my goodness, it's criminal not under our law, it's criminal under Sharia law.
Right.
So again, the accommodations of Sharia, which I think are part of the reason that this particular assassin, Hassan, Major Hassan, was allowed to remain in the military. I mean,
Diana West, let me interrupt you there just for a moment, because I think a term that you didn't use, but you used a number of different synonyms, but it's important. It's important to put it out there too, and that word is submission.
Yes.
And after all, that's the literal translation of Islam is submission, and it's so transparent that that's what Sharia is demanding, not just of Muslims, but of all of us. So I think your point is very well taken here, and what you've just connected in terms of these dots is a former commander of this facility who previously was engaged in this rank act of submission, and it's a microcosm of the larger problem that I think all of us are sort of scratching our heads and saying, how could this guy have been kept in our armed forces, given the kind of behavior he was exhibiting, given that he was disciplined at one point, I understand, because he was proselytizing, trying to take people he was treating and turn them into Muslim converts. I mean, this is as you say, connecting the dots. That's always easier in hindsight than at the time, but it does seem to reek of acts of submission. And worrying in the extreme is that it's gone unremarked and seemingly uncorrected to this point.
Right, and it's easy for us to sit here and connect the dots, but if you're looking at the media, the general coverage of this incident, it is the rare story or the rare newscaster who actually mentions that he was Muslim in anything but a most passing phase, and certainly in no way wondering if having yelled Allahu Akbar before beginning to mow down
God is great
soldiers,
right,
there was some connection. And my own I just went right to a kind of parallel to try to get people to think if 50, 60 years ago we had a German-American Nazi who was in the armed services of the United States yelling Sieg Heil before he began shooting up American soldiers in a similar massacre.
right.
Of course,
that dot would have been connected.
His Germanness, and whether he had been a member of the German-American Bund, for example, or his loyalty to this ideology would have been of great interest, as it should be, as a logical, rational human being would place it. I mean, that's where I think you really see the submission in our society at this moment, is when you see neither the military allowing questions or discussing this, or the media even asking the questions. So you end up talking about, what his latest work evaluation was, or whether he was merely psychologically disgruntled. We have people attributing post-traumatic stress syndrome to him, and he never was in combat.
I've heard that. Diana West, author of The Death of the Grown-Up, marvelous blogging on all kinds of topics, but particularly in this space at dianawest.net. Just on this point, you've chronicled self-censorship, in effect, in the media, as well as this political correctness and submission in the military, and it has to be said, in the larger civil government as well. Very quickly, we've only got about a minute left. I know you're as concerned as I am about the efforts that are going to make it very difficult, if not as a practical matter impossible, for us to have this kind of conversation. Those of us who see the problem and are willing to talk about it because it's going to be criminalized. Give us a quick dump on what's involved there.
Well, we are seeing efforts to rein in both the internet. We're seeing efforts to rein in talk radio. These are the impositions of restrictions from outside. My great concern is that too many Americans have already succumbed to what you mentioned earlier, which is in terms of self-censorship, and will not be sufficiently exercised at this elimination of freedom. So we're at it's a very parlous time in so many ways, and that certainly is gets right at the heart of our problem.
It does, and we're going to have to come back and delve into it more with you, Diana West, and I hope we'll be able to do it on a regular basis here at Secure Freedom Radio, particularly because one of the other aspects of this, of course, as you know very well, is the international norm that is now trying to be imposed upon all of us that will make this kind of conversation more difficult. But we're going to continue to have it as long as we're able to here at Secure Freedom Radio. Diana West, again, thank you for joining us and for all you do to shed light on this subject. Next up, we're going even deeper down into this problem with another of the country's real scholars and experts on Sharia, Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch. We're back with Secure Freedom Radio. We're going to be, as I said earlier, drilling down a little bit further on the Fort Hood massacre, a bit more on the context for this attack. And let's just say at the outset, because I know people will probably bellyache, we don't have all the facts. I know. I'm stipulating to the fact that we don't have all the facts. What we have, though, it would appear, are plenty of facts. I mean, sufficient numbers of facts of sufficiently troubling character that a lot of people are wondering what the devil happened here. And we talked about that, of course, a moment ago with Diana West. But we have with us now a true expert on what I believe is the motivation for this attack, namely Sharia. And that is Robert Spencer, the director of a marvelous web resource, Jihad Watch, a project of the splendid David Horowitz Freedom Center. You have doubtless heard about or seen Robert Spencer's writings almost innumerable books on various subjects that touch on this particular problem. And so we've asked Robert to come back to Secure Freedom Radio. I'm very pleased you did. Thank you for joining us.
Frank, always an honor to be here. Thank you.
Well, it's our privilege as well. I want to do two things with you, Robert, in the time we have, and we'll go by, as it always does, too quickly. One is to tell us, in your estimation, what you think prompted this fellow, Nidal Hassan, to allegedly engage in this massacre. And secondly, why it is that we're hearing from so many so-called mainstream Muslim groups that he couldn't have anything to do with their faith. Okay? First off, let's talk about Fort Hood.
Well, we know that this man was shouting Allahu Akbar as he opened fire. We know that he was handing out Qurans the morning of the attack. We know that he had adopted Arabic dress, traditional Muslim dress, just a few weeks ago, and that he evidently was very devout. He was a daily mosque attendee, and he had gotten raised eyebrows among his colleagues in the past for justifying suicide bombings, suicide attacks by Muslims, even saying that it would be justified for Muslims to rise up against Americans and the U.S. military.
Now,
so
where would he get this stuff? I mean, the dress and the religious practice and so on track with Sharia, right?
Yeah, they track with the understanding that it is part of a Muslim's religious responsibility to wage war against unbelievers and to subjugate them under the rule of Sharia, of Islamic law. These things are not invented by Nidal Hassan. They follow a pattern that we have seen many times with Islamic jihadists, that they grow more devout in their Islamic observance. They begin to take on Islamic dress, as we saw with him. They explicitly tie their actions to the Quran, as this man did when he was giving away his possessions yesterday and also giving out free Qurans, making me think that he was thinking he was going to die, and that's in accord with the Quran's promise of paradise, the only promise of paradise that the Quran contains anywhere. Paradise is promised to those who kill and are killed for Allah as part of this warfare in order to weaken the infidels and ultimately to impose Sharia upon them. And so it seems to me to be a trajectory of evidence that all points in the same direction and indicates that this was indeed an Islamic terror attack motivated by principles that are rooted in Sharia, in the Quran, in Islamic law.
In the authoritative practice of Islam, according to its traditions and institutions and so on. We're talking with Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch, an author of numerous books on this subject, all of which are required reading, and we'll talk more about them in a moment. But Robert, I just want to drill down on that particular point, because we're hearing almost inevitably, especially in the context of something like this, that, well, he's practicing some radical form of Islam, some strain that's political or extremist or fundamentalist or some other adjective is used. What you've just said, and I was echoing there, is not so. This is actually the true faith according to those who determine what's the true faith, isn't it?
Yes. The Islamic jihadists make their appeal in the Islamic world by presenting themselves as the exponents of the true faith. The authoritative voices in the Islamic world, the schools of Islamic law, the institutions like Al-Azhar University in Cairo and others, they all share the view that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against non-Muslims and ultimately to subjugate them under the rule of Sharia law. And so this is a mainstream thing in Islam. It's not the province of some newly minted heretical group that's twisting and hijacking the peaceful teachings of Islam, as goes the current myth.
Yeah. I mean, it really is almost an urban legend at this point, isn't it? We were talking with Diana West a moment ago about the fact that we now are engaging palpably in a self-censorship that prevents us from addressing this point. let alone, helping other people understand it. So this is why, among other things, your book Stealth Jihad is so important, because I think it's clearly a manifestation of that we're seeing this kind of restriction of free speech even before they criminalize it, which is, of course, another subject that we will dwell on with you at another occasion. But I think that what I would most like you to help us walk through is the statements that are now repeated endlessly. I mean, even as our own press exercises self-restraint and our politicians eschew talking about the kind of realities that you've just alluded to, we're getting stuff out of an organization like CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, that says in a statement that was issued last night, quote, "No political or religious ideology could ever justify or excuse such wanton and indiscriminate violence," unquote. That does not seem, Robert Spencer, to track with what you've just said about Islam.
Yes, that's quite right. I mean, in the first place, Frank, when I hear these kinds of statements, I think, well, what does anybody expect them to say? Yes, we think it's great. We wish it killed more infidels. I mean, obviously, for political calculation alone, they're not going to be talking in that way. But also, we have to compare CARE's deeds with its words. This is a group that is an unindicted co-conspirator in a Hamas terror funding case, has never condemned. I've repeatedly asked directly when I've been in debates with CARE spokesmen, repeatedly asked them to condemn Hamas and Hezbollah as terrorist organizations. They have unanimously and repeatedly refused to do so. They have several of their officials arrested and convicted for various terrorism-related activities. There are Islamic supremacist statements about the imposition of Sharia in the United States that CARE officials have made. And this is a group that is linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is dedicated to, in its own words, eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within. Mm-hmm. And so for them to come out with these kinds of condemnations, it reminds me, Frank, of a few years ago at Jihad Watch, I came across a form at a Muslim website about how to condemn terror attacks. And I kid you not, it was not a joke. It was an actual form that had the location and the number killed and the date of the Islamic terror attack blank. And you filled that part in, and then the rest of it was all pro forma. We condemn this attack. Islam does not teach these things. Islam is peaceful. We stand with Americans against the attacks on innocent civilians, and so on. It's really just a smoothly deceptive thing.
Formulaic.
CARE has resisted every anti-terror effort that's come down the pike, and then they issue these pro forma condemnations just to fool people.
Yeah. It's a concept that you're very familiar with, Robert, that I'd just like to spend our last minute together talking about. It's called Taqiyya. Right. Yeah. Tell us about that practice under Sharia.
Absolutely. The Quran says that you're not to take unbelievers as your allies or friends and protectors in preference to believers, and unless it says you are doing it to guard yourselves against them. And that's the key phrase, because it's been understood by Islamic exegetes and by those who have laid out the rules of Sharia as meaning that you can deceive in service of Islam. Smile in the faces of some people while behind your backs they curse them. Yeah. That is a quote from the Imam Bukhari, who is one of the most influential and important Islamic teachers in history. And so this is religiously sanctioned deception designed to protect the religion from harm and to allow it to spread, particularly to spread in terms of the political aspects of Islam, that is Sharia. And so there is the impetus for this kind of large-scale deception, which I believe we're seeing these days with these condemnations of the attack.
Deception on their part, the Islamists, the adherents to Sharia, self-censorship, and worse on our part, leaving us naked in the face of an enemy that is not only elsewhere, but here amongst us. Robert Spencer of Jihad Watch, author of Stealth Jihad, Religion of Peace, The Truth About Muhammad, and numerous other wonderful books. Check him out at jihadwatch.org.